So welcome to the fourth class of Heidegger and Plato. My plan is to run through a summary of the essay. I thought, because I want to give Heidegger as much due as possible. And then next week, I will present a drawing of the divided line and a couple of quotes from Plato, and try and build an interpretation which I take to be more Platonic, and that way we can then have a discussion about what view we find more persuasive. But any questions or comments about anything thus far you want clarified or you would like to suggest before I bring up this handout? So is this visible?
Yes.
Okay, let me know if I need to make it bigger or...
Yes, bigger, please.
Bigger.
Definitely bigger.
How's that?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. I'll put this on I'll send this round and put it on the Dropbox. And I thought we will go to the summary of Heidegger's essay. I just wanted to provide an example from the dialogues of what I think the question is. So this is an excerpt from Plato's Euthyphro, which is a discussion on piety and justice and the relation between those two things. And it has this brief discussion on two kinds of argument, two kinds of difference of opinion. One leads to argument and the other can be resolved by calculation or measurement. And I'll just read through it and then make a comment. So Socrates is talking to Euthyphro and he says, difference over what things, best of men, produces enmity and anger. Examine it like this. If you and I were to differ about some numbers as to which was more, would the difference about this make us enemies? Enemies between one another. Or would we go to calculation about them and be reconciled? And Euthyphro agrees that we'd be reconciled after calculating. Socrates says, similarly, if we differed about what is greater and lesser, we would go to measure and cease our differences. And Euthyphro agrees. And Socrates says, and I suppose we would go to weighing in order to judge between the heavier and the lighter. And Euthyphro agrees. So Socrates says, so differing about what and not being able to arrive at any judgment about it leads us to become enemies and hate one another. Perhaps it's not obvious to you, but examine it. So there must have been a pause because Euthyphro doesn't know what he's talking about, which is a clue to Euthyphro's character and the dialogue. But we'll just go to the point. Perhaps it's not obvious to you, but examine as I go on whether it's these things, the just and unjust, the noble and base, and the good and bad. Isn't it these things that, when we differ and are not able to come to a sufficient judgment about them, that we become enemies to one another whenever we do become enemies, both I and you and all human beings? So that's comprehensive. And Euthyphro agrees. So there are this situation, this is the human situation in which we appear to have, this is a very simplistic way of putting it, but in our experience, there are qualities and quantities. And there are qualities that determine the character of our life, because what justice is what our decision about that determines a lot of how we act and how we respond to things and how we feel and so on. Whereas those things, they are mostly transmitted to us. Well, they're mostly transmitted to us. They're not things that we come across and make up on our own, despite the fact that we are now told, of course, that every human being creates their own view of the world and so on. Despite that, we know that's false. We know that everyone is brought up in the opinion of what's just and unjust, roughly, in some version of their political community, and so on and so forth. So that means they have a much different origin and character than things that we can measure quantitatively. So the question of the character of human life depends upon what you do with this fact. And I think there are 87 possible alternatives, of which I think there are 3 central ones. And this is just another way of putting the different alternatives that I did in the first handout. And we can go back to that next week because it looks at this in more detail and from a different perspective. Okay, so the classical point of view, and you get this in Plato and Aristotle, is that there are 2 kinds of measure. There's the measure of the fitting or the good or the appropriate in a whole range of senses, which includes just and unjust and the noble and base and so on. And that is just as valid a measure as that of quantity. The difference between the two is not that one is more true. They're both true. In fact, the quantitative one is in some ways derivative from the qualities. And so for example, in Plato's Statesman, the Eleatic stranger refers to 2 kinds of measure, and he means the qualitative and the quantitative. But even deeper than that, the Plato and Aristotle describe the quantitative measure as only having its context from the qualitative. If you don't care about the truth, then the form of measure is not useful. It won't lead to agreement. So it's what I'm calling the qualitative that provides the context for what we would now call objective means of measure. But that leads us to a problem, is that we do not have a so-called objective means of measure for these qualitative aspects of life, which is why, for example, Aristotle will say in the Ethics, you ought to do what is noble. And what is the noble? Well, that's what the noble human being does. And how do we know that's a noble human being? Because he or she does noble things. It's entirely a circular argument. It depends upon your ability to see a measure in a paradigm or an example in a way that we can't persuasively make someone see a number, which is which in some ways is much easier to make someone see, which is why mathematics derives from the root for learning, because it's the most clear way of learning. Okay, but that's the classical view. So the modern view appears to give priority in objectivity and in reliability to the quantitative measure. In fact, that's the definition of objectivity. But that means that the non-quantitative are subjective, and that soon becomes merely subjective, so that reality, the non-quantitative reality, is just how you perceive things. It's your worldview, it's your values, etc., etc. Or in Nietzsche tried to give this the highest possible view. He tried to say that you create the values by which any measure has its significance, any objective measure. Now, I think that's a difficult view to hold, because the creation tends to collapse into the nihilism that it was invented to prevent. If you're interested in that view, we are doing Thus Spoke Zarathustra later in the year, which is one of Nietzsche's main articulations of his recognition of the problem and an attempt to overcome it. So the other view is that the qualitative is given historically, but it has just as much truth or being as the quantitative. So like the classical view, the qualitative, the principles, ends, standards, within which we find a place for science and a place for poetry and so on, those have just as much binding force, and I'm using this phrase deliberately, I'll come back to it, just as much binding force as any mathematical formula, and that agrees with the classics. But in this view, it's historically given in differently in different times and places. I think those are the rough three alternatives of how we respond to this problem Socrates describes. Any questions? Or
Martin is the third Heidegger.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and I picked out this. I'm actually writing an essay on the impossibility of teaching ethics, and this phrase "binding force" is something of a theme, because I just noticed that in Aristotle, Plato, and in moderns like Mill, and in Nietzsche and Heidegger, there are a number of places where they're trying to describe your most serious motive about things and they use a very similar phrase for Bindlichkeit in German, which is very like binding, binding force, which is why it's translated sometimes like that in English. And so, ancient moderns, postmoderns, they are all gesturing towards that which we find compulsory, and that's the true aspect of, for example, nobility. You'd think you must do this because it would be base not to do it, and that's different from thinking that everything's a free choice. But the philosophical question: what's the source of that binding force? Is it history? Is it nature? Or is it created, which is the second view? Now, by the modern view, I'm being extremely, extremely simplistic because I'm trying to take in a way not radically dissimilar from Heidegger, everyone from Descartes to Nietzsche. Because Descartes, you will have all heard the phrase cogito ergo sum. I cogitate, I think, therefore I am. And if that's the first principle of Descartes' thought, then it means, and the second principle is that what I can know is only that I'm thinking. Everything else is indeterminate, except for mathematics, because it doesn't matter if I'm awake or asleep, or if I have a body or I don't. Mathematical formulae remain the same. So that becomes the criteria for reality, and the reality that we experience as a mind and a body together is less determinate. And the good and bad that we see in things, the just and unjust and so on, those things, Descartes says, are like a label that we place upon things. And you only have to turn that around to become Nietzsche. If it's a label that we place upon things, we could have made it differently. And there are more noble rank orders of values than yours, Descartes, says Nietzsche. But then the problem is, can we really understand the binding force that we see in principles as coming from our own creation? I think that's very difficult. Okay, so therefore, for the purpose of this course, we're looking at number 1 and 3 as being the two really competing views of the source of the truth: nature, history, and in particular, but anything further on that? I have been very elliptical. If there's any question, clarification, rebuke.
I find that really helpful. I've never seen that laid out like that, but just being able to quickly refer back to those 3, that, do you know what I mean, to put everything into, I think that really helps. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah. It is, especially with this essay, I think, it's more helpful to try and make some simplistic remarks, because he writes many interesting and beautiful things, but we have to come to a decision about what it means, and if that's going to require some simplification and clarity. Okay, now I've got 3 pages of this summary, and so I want to go through reasonably quickly the pages we've discussed in some detail. So the question that he begins with is what is the meaning of the cave allegory that he translates in the pages prior to page 164. And he is setting apart, he doesn't make this altogether clear. So everything in bold is my attempt to give a clear articulation of what I think is his division in the interpretation he wants to give. Open to question, that's my suggestion. So he wants to divide Plato's answer, which is Plato's conscious attempt to teach something, from what Heidegger thinks is the real teaching of the dialogue that was not consciously visible to Plato. So for Plato's, the meaning of the allegory is the correspondence between the physical objects that you see in the image, and their correspondence to reality. So the cave's shadows are like everyday experience. The man-made fire is like our habitual life. The things outside the cave correspond to the ideas, and the sun corresponds to the highest idea, or the idea of the good. Now, that's a slightly Heideggerian interpretation because it's not so much everyday experience and habitual life, although that's true and important, but it's ultimately the life of the political community, although it has its origins in what the poets make, and Heidegger would be in agreement with that. Okay, so that's how Plato articulates it, but Heidegger's interpretation is that the proper dimension of the allegory is not these correspondence, but the movements of passage. And this relates to what we have discussed thus far, is that he sees that there is a change in the essence of truth expressed through this teaching, and therefore there's going to be a contest in which one version of the truth triumphs over the others, and therefore there must be movement and conflict. Excuse me 1 second, I'm just going to try and shut out the helicopters, no doubt, going forth to.
We're not hearing anything from that, Martin.
Okay. It just reminded me, I was getting PTSD from the protests when they were illegal. Not that I ever went, of course. Okay, so.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Martin. There's one thing that, I told you I keep reading this stuff, but there's one thing that really got to me, and it's a direct translation of the Greek, where Heidegger says that Plato says that when the person who's been freed turns around and looks at the fire and begins to see that things look different, right?
Yeah.
He says that the Greek says he is therefore looking more correctly. Dürfte wohl richtiger blicken.
And that's
That the Greek has a number after it, 515D, 3/4.
thanks.
And
Okay, so I'll just read the sentence in from the Greek. So
yes.
so if someone were to tell him that at that time he was looking at nonsense things, but that now he is somewhat closer to being, to what is, and that having been turned towards those which are in being more, are more in being,
Yes.
having been turned that way, he would see more correctly.
Yes.
Okay, so that's what someone tries to explain to him, that you could now see more correctly because you're closer to what is. But then the person responds that they reject that because the shadows are still more clear to them. Is that?
Yeah. But Heidegger doesn't go on with that one. But to me, that seems to be the whole point that Heidegger is basing his argument on, that the correctness comes in of being the same as the truth. It has to be correct, therefore. And in fact, at one stage, he goes on that it's more correct. That he
Yes.
comparative. So he's not mistranslating or anything, is he? It's just, it is
Not there. No, definitely not. Yeah.
Okay.
And you're right. And this is what he wants to, yeah, right. It's a very helpful point. He is saying that, yeah, Socrates has the person say to the freed prisoner, you would see more correctly the closer to you are to being. And so that means we have these two things, that you're closer to being and you can see more correctly. And Heidegger wants to say that this is now bringing more and more emphasis upon our seeing correctly.
Yeah.
No, and that translates in quite right. Yeah.
But that is it. That he's got a point. I mean, Heidegger has a point.
Yes, it's definitely there. So what do we make of it? Because he wants to say that this means that we're making, I don't know, I keep using bad words like subjective, but we're putting the human being, making the human being the measure of what is. And what he seems to be suggesting is that we don't have access to the process by which a being is what it is.
Mhm.
I mean, the way I'll put this, by appealing to my simplistic suggestion before, is that we're trying to, we're taking the mind to be able to see the genuine principles of things, but they're given to us historically. So what we have to do is be open to our historical opportunities and seize them. So that's both a passive and an active stance, but it's particular. You can only be part of an historical people. You can't be part of an historical, for example, globe, because you would have to get rid of all horizons in order to do that. That's my
Yes,
understanding.
yeah, I quite take all that. But Heidegger also puts a huge amount of stress on the light and how much the light permits you to see.
Can I make a suggestion there, Martin?
Yep.
Yeah. So if there's a person with very big eyes at the roof of the cave, he can look down and he can see some people still have their necks shackled. They can only see the shadows. The person on the roof of the cave can see this person who's broken away, and they can see both the shadows and the fire and the puppets. So the person at the roof of the cave can see that one person has a superior understanding because they can see both puppets and the shadows. One person can only see the shadows, which is an inferior understanding.
Yep.
And similarly, there'll be someone outside the cave who can see that there's also the sun itself, which is much more glorious and superior to a fire.
Yeah.
Okay, that's just what I wanted to say.
Yeah. No. So, which from Heidegger's point of view, I think is you were okay. So you've accepted this correctness version of truth, and you've alienated yourself from your historical possibilities, which exist only inside the cave. Well, what Plato has invented is the notion that there's an outside of the cave. All that what there is in human existence is this contest between light and dark within the cave. There's no outside. The outside is an illusion that there's an atemporal natural principle that you can that you can grasp with the mind. That's my simple version. I'm happy to have that rejected. And his connection between that and the modern problem, which is that, you know, we're subjecting the varieties of our experience formed by different histories, by different works of literature, which are, you know, and other writings that are fundamental to people's sensibility. If we subject that to universal technical standards, we diminish it. And that to me makes perfect sense. Sorry, Margarita, you.
No, that's all right. It's just that the light does play a huge role there, and that ties in with depending on how much your view, you know, this lovely helioides, how much your eye shares, partakes of the light. I mean, that's a huge thing. And maybe because of the German, you know how you play with Schein, Erschein, and Vorschein. I mean, it's endless. And so it just grows, you know. And it's much there's a lot more in his argument, I think. You know, I mean, we could spend weeks on this, and I would have loved that. But
Yeah. No, that's why, I mean, you made the very good point that this article is closely linked to the one on the essence of truth and so on. But I really thought if we just focus on one essay, we can begin to do justice to the density of the argument. I'm not saying we're going to succeed at that, but it's, yeah, as you say, we can spend a lot of time. I just want to say, so the argument about light is that light is commensurate with intelligible object and mind.
yeah,
And what he's saying is that it's the intellect is not the fundamental comportment to the serious objects of life. And that's why this is an error. And and this is a very common theme in modernity ever since the first reaction against modernity by people like Rousseau, is that no, if you're telling us that the reason is just the instrument to the passions, then that means the objects of the passions and of the body of the human being as a whole are much more important and more revealing of reality than your logic constructing mind. And that's what Heidegger, I believe, is also suggesting when he gives this priority to human comportment, to your whole orientation. And that's why he likes that phrase about when Socrates says, you can't, education requires, this is where he partly agrees, is that education is not a process of absorbing information, it's a reorientation of the whole human psyche. But I'm thinking that from his point of view, Plato forgets that and undercuts that by giving this priority to the intellect over the whole human comportment. And that comes back to the emphasis upon light, as if that clarity can be given to us and that's sufficient.
It's fascinating.
Can I ask a quick question, Martin, just in regard to, we're talking about the light. This is slightly off topic, so please slap me down if necessary. At one point in the article that in our handout on the path marks, it's talking about, Heidegger's talking about the sun as source of light, lends visibility to whatever is seen, yada, yada, yada. But then he says the eye itself emits light.
Yes.
So can you just, does that mean like as in the eye reflects actual light, or does that mean in the sense that, you know, the eye is the window to the soul and, you know, that there is light and like, you know, as in kind of wisdom, you know, or, do you know what I mean? At what level? Is that a very face value type statement, or what am I missing there? I didn't quite understand that or know what to make of it.
I don't entirely either. There was a view which is expressed in another of the Platonic dialogues, or a couple of them, that the eye does emit light and that's how it sees. Like things are visible because of the sun, but there's a yeah. The eye is like not radar. I can't think of an appropriate metaphor. But I don't know if that's Socrates' view, because this is expressed by Timaeus in a dialogue named after Timaeus, and in the Meno it's attributed to Empedocles. So I'm not quite sure if that's what Heidegger is suggesting about Plato, or if that's what Heidegger is suggesting about this is a Greek view, or yes. I wonder if anyone else has any suggestion. He does definitely say, as Margarita has pointed out a couple of times, that there is this kinship between sight and the sun, which is the condition for sight, that is light. Light has to make things visible for the sight, who has some kinship with light, and that makes some sense. I'm not quite sure exactly how we use that. Well, the way we use that for the metaphor for intelligibility is that the human mind has a receptive capacity for the intelligible unities that make up what things are, apart from their physical characteristics, for the intelligible unities. And that's impossible unless somehow things are given intelligibility. And that given intelligibility is the metaphor for that is the intelligibility they get from the idea of the good.
I think just on this issue of light and sight, I think there's a tradition that Homer was blind, and there's similar traditions in other cultures, I think, and they suggest that having eyeballs is not essential for insight, and indeed having eyeballs, not having eyeballs is perhaps a way by which a human learns to develop greater acuteness in their other senses. And I think there have been human beings who have lacked hearing as well as sight, but they've been able to learn as other human beings do. The famous name, Helen Keller in America. So people don't actually need, human beings don't actually need sight or hearing. It's very difficult, of course, but they can learn.
Yeah, this goes back to my argument last time where I was saying that at the range of our sense perception is, I mean, it doesn't mean it goes back to my argument, but the one I would like to, the aspect of what you're suggesting I'd like to pick up on is that the range of our sense perception is not the most relevant thing to our understanding of the intelligibility of a thing. We could have the vision of cats, the ability to smell of pigs, or whatever it is. They can be a completely different range from what we have, but those are merely our access to aspects of the thing that we grasp with the mind. And Helen Keller is this wonderful example of this. If you read this autobiography of hers, and it's a central point of it is that she's become a very difficult child after she's become blind, deaf, and mute, because she can't communicate, and it's incredibly frustrating and painful for her. And there's a moment where she has this amazingly patient teacher who's trying to teach her and not making much progress, but there's a moment where she is able to understand and articulate with the name water, that she understands this thing here running through her hands constitutes a unified being different from the tap, the grass, and so on and so forth. And that she has, and she describes this moment at length, and it's one of the best descriptions of what it means to understand the intelligible unity of a thing as opposed to its sense perception. And she's been in this very difficult situation of being trying to intellect a world with very little sense perception to go by, just touch. And she can't hear her own words, but she learns to speak and to write. Well, not write, dictate. So that I think is a great demonstration of this difference between our sensible and our intellectual capacity.
She doesn't learn to do those things by herself.
No.
She doesn't learn them unaided.
No.
Yeah, but neither does anyone, neither does any child.
I just had a comment in relation to Trish's question about how it's expressed that this relationship between the eye and the sun, and I wonder if it's symbiotic in a way, in a very limited sense, that the sun's useless without eyes. And in a sense, and again in a very limited way, you really can't have one without the other. Photosynthesis aside, but for the purposes of seeing, the sun has no purpose without eyes. And that's just an observation that I have, as I often do, just shooting from the hip again. But
keep that in mind. Keep that in mind, because when we get to what Heidegger is saying about the history of philosophy after Plato, that will become directly relevant at the point of Aristotle. So if we can just hold that point, and we'll come back to it shortly. And to make that. Sorry.
I just said thank you. Sorry, I think I got us off track, but I do appreciate it.
No, the questions are always very helpful. I am going to try and move a little bit quicker just until we get to where we did actually read up to. So Plato's assertion is that the allegory of the cave illustrates the essence of education. That is, you go from the darkness of opinion to knowledge. Heidegger's interpretation, by contrast, means to point out the Platonic doctrine of truth. And I'll read this quote. Plato's thinking subjects itself to a transformation in the essence of truth. Now, this is, if you're anyone in the history of philosophy, prior to Nietzsche or prior to Heidegger, that's an extremely difficult phrase. Transformation in the essence of truth. Because the word essence means the unchanging being of a thing. So that's precisely what can't transform. The thing transforms. It matures into its essence and then passes away, and so on. So yeah, he's using this in a very different way. So transformation in the essence of truth, that becomes the hidden law governing what the thinker says. So Plato is not conscious of this change that he is articulating. According to our interpretation, which is made necessary from out of a future need, and I mentioned last time, that's because there is no such thing as a purely theoretical interest. In Plato, the dialogues are dedicated to several things, one of which is to say that you, qua human being, have an interest in knowing the truth for itself. You get the same argument compressed very greatly into the first 2 chapters of Aristotle's Metaphysics, which attempts to persuade you that your idle curiosity in things is an intimation of your desire to know about being qua being. But people like of the stature of Nietzsche and Heidegger reject the notion that there are such theoretical entities, and therefore they reject the notion that there is a theoretical life. That makes no sense. So we go back to these thinkers out of a current need, because we are living out a historical destiny that they formed. Right. I just want to make that clear. Okay. So according to our interpretation, which is made necessary from out of a future need, the allegory not only illustrates the essence of education, but at the same time opens our eyes to a transformation in the essence of truth. Okay. So I think we've discussed enough this twofold aspect of the conscious and unconscious teaching presented in the cave image. So he then makes the point that there must therefore be an essential relation between education and the truth, and his suggestion is that Plato's understanding of the truth brings into being the kind of thing we call education henceforth. Now, as we discussed, truth becomes what we now call the correspondence theory of truth, the equivalent of the intellect and the thing on the basis of this transformation. And he intends to show how this works through these 4 different stages in the allegory. And we discussed, the first one, when you're chained up, engrossed in the immediate, what is presented as the immediate reality. Then the freedom of the person who was turned around, but still takes the shadows to be more true or more unhidden. And he's using this word unhidden. His intermediate word is manifest. Things are manifest to us. And then the next sentence he says unhidden. And that's preparation to understand what he means by aletheia, or the truth. But it makes a kind of sense. What we say is what's true is what's visible and that we can confirm for ourselves, what's manifest and therefore unhidden. But the corollary for him is that what is unhidden is posterior to what is hidden. And it's the process of unhiddenness that is important to understand. Okay, and not what is unhidden at one point. I'll read this one quote from his interpretation of the stage 3, where the person is outside the cave. Authentic liberation is the steadiness of being oriented toward that which appears in its visible form and which is the most unhidden in disappearing. Freedom exists only as the orientation that is structured in this way. But what is more, this orientation as a turning toward alone fulfills the essence of paideia, of education, as a turning around. The essence of education is grounded in the essence of truth. So Plato consciously wants to make the image about education, but he does that through establishing a new idea of what's truth, and on that basis. So the 4th stage is the return to the cave of the previously released and now educated prisoner. But because the essence of paideia, of education, sometimes I got bored of typing in the Greek letters. It takes a lot longer, so I just used the transliteration. Because the essence of paideia consists in the periagorge, holes, tes, psyches, the turning around of the whole psyche, the whole soul. Then insofar as it is such a turning around, it constantly remains an overcoming of paideusa, of lack of education. Education, paideia, includes within itself an essential relation to lack of education. Now, he's going to say this is the same as their understanding of truth. Education is directly related to truth because it's an education in truth. But Plato's understanding of truth is that there is this static, eternal, natural truth that you can depart from your historical community to understand. Whereas Heidegger is asserting that that is not the authentic understanding of truth, which is always in relation to the untruth. And he's saying here the same about education, which this is irrelevant for whether or not Heidegger's right, but that's not what Plato is saying. So for Plato, the going up and the coming back down are radically different things. First of all, the going up, and Michael mentioned this before, requires someone else to drag you up in this context. Whereas the coming back down is the coming back to participate in the discursive, political, historical community, presumably for different reasons. Yeah, so that's not the struggle between truth and untruth from Plato's point of view. From Heidegger's point of view, it is. Okay. I'll read this quote at the top. Since, according to Plato's allegory, the supremely unhidden, that is the most true, must be wrested from a base and stubborn hiding. For this reason, one's movement out of the cave and into the open and into the light of day is a life and death struggle. Now, that fits his interpretation, but it's not, it's not true to what Plato is suggesting, because Plato is the life and death struggle is only in the return into the cave. And the life and death struggle is between the person orientated by the truth and the people orientated by political ends, by fortune and honor. It's not a life and death struggle to escape the cave. That may be uncomfortable. It may cause pain and disorientation, especially initially, but that's not the life and death struggle. I just point this out just because I want to separate Plato's understanding within himself and Heidegger's interpretation so that we can see them both clearly. Okay, so the result of this is what Heidegger says at one point is the Platonic revolution, which is that unhiddenness in this original Greek sense of aletheia, without oblivion, without forgetting. Unhiddenness in the Greek sense is properly experienced in the allegory, but in place of unhiddenness, another essence of truth pushes to the fore. And this is what Margarita was discussing before, this notion that truth is correctness and depends much more upon the orientation of the mind. For Plato, the power of the images depends on the light, as was said before. And Heidegger says, certainly unhiddenness is mentioned in its various stages, but it is considered simply in terms of how it makes whatever appears to be accessible in its visible form, and in terms of how it makes this visible form, as that which shows itself, be visible. So truth is mentioned only as what makes the being of a thing visible. Truth is not mentioned as this contest. So then he says, only in this Platonic revolution do, and then he uses two Greek words that are clearly etymologically related, noein and nous. So noein is the act of the intellect. And I've been saying in this course sometimes this very awkward expression, to intellect something, just because I want to keep nous, which is the intellect, and the act of intellecting together. It sounds extremely awkward in English, but I don't know of a better way to do it. Nous is often translated mind. In fact, in Australian English, I used to hear older people say this, like use your nous. And that just means be smart, use your intelligence, which is a translation. Obviously, the Australian people are always deeply imbued in Greek thought. So only in this Platonic revolution do the intellect, the act of intellecting, and the intellect itself, and he says apprehending, or in this translation, do they first get referred essentially to the idea. The adoption of this orientation to the ideas henceforth determines the essence of apprehension and subsequently of reason. Now, to read a little bit into this, I'm thinking he has in mind something like, there's a phrase of Parmenides, which I happen to have conveniently written on the wall. Tok ga auto esten noein tek kai einai, which means for the same thing is to intellect and to be. The same thing is to intellect and to be. And in Heidegger's interpretation, because being gives itself at different times, and it can only give itself to mind, the intellect and being are a kind of a bifold that's also a unity, because what is given is what is received differently, but what is given and what is received is the same. I'm not doing justice to the full argument, but now intellect is not related to being and the whole being process that is this struggle between hiddenness and unhiddenness. It gets referred to what is clear and accessible to the mind, to the shining open look of the thing. That I think is part of what he's suggesting. And that's for the ideas in general. And then he says of the idea of the good, unhiddenness, the truth, is yoked into a relation with seeing by the idea of the good, which is properly seen last, because it is the power which makes things visible or shine. And part of what he's suggesting is going to turn out to be is that, first of all, we've turned this process by which things emerge into view, this process of the contest of oblivion and openness or truth, unhiddenness, by turning unhiddenness into a thing, the form of a thing. And now we turn the cause of that, which should be the process of which the essence of being is, we've turned that itself into a thing, the idea of the good. Okay. We are actually making considerable progress. I'm shocked. Because I think we have how much more? Actually, no, quite a bit more. Okay. So, consequences of the Platonic revolution. Calling the good the highest idea, as Plato does, allows for the understanding later on of the highest thing to be the moral good, as, for example, the opening lines of the groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals by Kant. Or the highest thing is values, as in Nietzsche. Since values sustains Nietzsche's thought, and all knowledge derives from the metaphysical origin of values, to that extent, Nietzsche is the most unrestrained Platonist in the history of metaphysics. I'll finish the sentence and then try to give some interpretation to that. But insofar as he understands value as the condition of the possibility of life, a condition posited by life itself, he is held on to the essence of agathon, which is this Greek word meaning good. Okay, so what he's saying here is that Nietzsche is, on the one hand, has followed out the furthest extent of what Plato begins. So Plato begins by putting the emphasis on the mind because he invents the notion that there are stable objects of the mind. But the ultimate end of that is to say that the mind invents its own objects and creates values rather than as receptive to the being of things. Now, on the other hand, Nietzsche also says that values are posited out of the requirements of life, but that means they're posited out of not an intellectual activity, not an intellectual perception, but out of the human essence. And so it has this ambiguous sense, part of which Heidegger is sympathetic to. Okay, but the modern consequence is that we take truth to be subjective, and he uses this term. The essence of the idea is percipio, that is to be perceived, or subjective representation. And the idea of the good is a value in itself, of which we have an idea. Okay, so he's saying you begin with Plato to say that the intellect is the measure of reality, but that in modernity that gets reinterpreted as, well, the representation of things is the being of things. And when he says percipio there, he's referring to this phrase, I think, esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived, which is Bishop Berkeley's little phrase from Principles of Philosophy. Okay, so Plato's interpretation turns into modern subjectivity. And then, just going in the order of the essay, he returns to the original idea of the good, in the Greek idea of the good. So, to agathon, it's just the Greek word for the good. The good is what is capable and makes another to be capable of something. That's not insane. I'm not quite sure what I think of it. The idea provides a look of what a being is, enabling whatness and presence in its constancy. Therefore, the idea of ideas is that which enables as such the good itself. As bringing about shining, it is that which is most able to shine. Now, so I think he's saying, you, Plato, make the idea the being of a thing, and that means you've turned the being of a thing into a thing. It's look. And then what enables that is itself another being, the idea of the good. Now, this is how he's suggesting Plato is reinterpreting the good. Since it enables everything else, the good is the ideia teleutaya, which means the last idea. Now, this is not strictly speaking what happens in the Greek. What happens in the text is that Socrates says, now, the person outside the cave, would see the forms and then would see the idea of the good itself last. He doesn't say it's the last, because teleutaya, there's a word telos from which we get teleology, which means both last in time or final, as well as the end of something, the completion or fulfillment of something. In any case, that's how Heidegger interprets it here. It's highest, it's the completion, it's the perfect idea. It's highest in the hierarchy of making possible, and seeing it is the difficult task of looking straight up, which I think is an elusive reference to the fact that Plato, in inventing these beings, is inventing the possibility of theory. And Heidegger wants to say, no, prior to theory, prior to practice, prior to both of those being divided, there is our existential situation or our comportment to our essence. That is prior to theory and practice. Whereas Plato is arguing for the priority of theory, which is here depicted as looking straight up and gazing at the ideas. So, whereas the fire is the image for the unrecognized grounds of any experiencing of beings that intends them without knowledge, without knowing them as such, the very essence of paideia consists in making the human being strong and free for the clarity and constancy of insight into essence, on which practice as well as theory depends. Now, I'll just try and explicate that slightly. So the fire is the image for being in the realm of opinion and not knowledge, for experiencing things without knowing what they genuinely are. So education is the transformation of opinion into knowledge, which requires making one strong and free for that clarity. And as he correctly suggests here, for Plato, both theory and practice depend upon the intelligibility of things. Practice may not be aware of that, but that's what he claims. Okay.
But
I don't know how hard.
I just wanted to ask. So you say Heidegger takes issue with Plato on his. So Heidegger saying he wants to give priority to what comes before the highest things, but doesn't the allegory of the cave do that by having the story in the allegory start with the lowest condition of us just looking at the shadows and more generally the dialogues in general, where it's just the whole panorama of every dialogue is just our existence in the practical world.
That's Plato.
Yes. So it's an error then, from Heidegger's point of view, to say that there's an outside. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in that, when Socrates and the other guys are telling this story,
Yep.
they're led by Socrates to see something outside, which in a way is inside, because they're standing on the road in Athens telling this story, and it's like something that's outside, but they've found it inside this discussion.
Well, actually, they're in Cephalus's house, and they were promised dinner, and they never get it, and the torches are brought in at one point, so they've spent 8 hours, and they were promised a festival and a horse race, and instead they're trapped in this philosophical conversation. But yes.
Yeah, so they never even got there. So in this room, they've it's like listening to a story, storyteller that you're just sitting there, a great storyteller, and yeah. So
if I understand what you're getting at, Socrates temporarily attracts these young people that he's speaking to. First of all, he has to withstand an attack by a sophist, and which was arranged. The whole thing's been a bit of a setup because they want to hear these two people talk, Socrates and Thrasymachus. Socrates manages to attract them into an 8-hour discussion, and he tries to show them through these images a different way of life, one concerned with the truth first of all, and only secondarily with practice. And he does that by, first of all, appealing to their strongest practical desire. They want to know if it's worthwhile being just. Like, why should I obey the law when we know that criminals prosper and we know that people who are very decent sometimes suffer? And that's a very practical, fundamental human problem. And he, first of all, reorientates them by saying, well, what would a just city be? And then he reorientates them further. Well, what would the rulers of a city have to know to make it a just city? And that ends up being the truth of justice. And then he tries to reorient them further by suggesting we're only going to have just rulers who desire, if they desire the truth. They won't desire to come back into the cave, so we'll have to force them. So the city of justice, founded upon the principle that everyone does the work suited to their nature, is founded on the injustice of making the people who most want to know practice politics. So that is all, and meant to be an illumination of the theoretico-practical problem of human life. But what I suggest he is trying to do is, and might be what you're suggesting, he's trying to show them the attraction of the theoretical way of life, and he's trying to argue for it. But it's a theoretical way of life for one person or a few people, It's not. It's in contrast with any communal possibility. And so when he makes several references throughout the Republic that make it sound as if he is building a statue or they're reflecting on a shadow. And these are hints that, you know, every discursive conversation in the agora, in Parliament, in the street, in the dialogue in Cephalus's house, that is in the cave arguing over images. Now, he is saying that theory is possible, though, that the reason we have our discursive argument is because of the illumination it instantaneously gives us intermittently into the actual truth of things. Heidegger is saying, no, you're reorientating human life away from that whole context, which is the center of human existence. You're alienating the intellect from the rest of human life. And you invented theoretical objects of the intellect in order to do this.
Okay, but I mean, Heidegger thought of himself either as a thinker or a philosopher, as presumably did, you know, Plato and Aristotle.
No, well, he definitely thought of himself as a thinker and not a philosopher. And he thought the whole philosophical tradition, which has come to an end with Nietzsche, is having now disastrous results in the whole technological conquest of the earth. And what we need is that tradition to be completely destroyed so that we can prepare the space for a new kind of thinking, of which he is the shepherd, the preparer.
So what would he say is the distinguishing mark or marks between thinker and philosopher?
We would have to read a lot more books.
Okay.
We're trying to get through one essay.
So
Okay, so I'll just go a little bit more because I don't know how painful it is to go through it in this manner or not. That's as far as we need to get through to discuss this essay in sections, and then we can pick out any parts of the essay you wish to discuss, and I've got some paragraphs I'd like to read and discuss too. So we'll have the break at 10 past. I'll just read through a paragraph or two more. So this is the main point that he's making, the transformation in the essence of truth. This allegory, I'll just read this quote at the top of the page. This allegory contains Plato's doctrine, his teaching of truth, for the allegory is grounded in the unspoken event whereby ideia, the form, the idea, gains dominance over aletheia, the truth, as the unhidden, which is in contrast with hiddenness. So the stable form takes over from the process of the illumination of things. Henceforth, the essence of truth does not, as the essence of hiddenness, so the essence of what is unhidden is hiddenness. That's the essence. The essence is not the knowable, articulable form of a thing. It's that which is on the other side of the truth from the human mind and can't be seen directly. So henceforth, the essence of truth does not, as the essence of unhiddenness, unfold from its proper and essential fullness, but rather shifts to the essence of the idea, the form. The essence of truth gives up its fundamental trait of unhiddenness. Okay, so the essence of truth gives us its fundamental trait of always being in contest with what is hidden. So, and the consequence of that is our efforts must be concentrated on correctness of vision, in modern terms, epistemology, endless discussions of how we can know what we know, and endless technical narrowing of what it is we think we know, based upon the thing that we think we know most, mathematics, right? And the agreement of the act of knowing with the thing itself, correspondence form of the truth. Yeah. Truth is still a fundamental trait of being themselves, but as the correctness of the gaze, it becomes a characteristic of human comportment toward things. So if we think that what is true is that which is accessible to the mind in the visible form of a thing, we ignore the fact that that truth is only accessible because of a whole human comportment, which is more than the intellect, which involves the emotions and moods and so on. Okay. Now, he says that there is a necessary ambiguity in Plato's doctrine. This is precisely what attests to the heretofore unsaid but now sayable change in the essence of truth. There's a necessary ambiguity because you can't quite get rid of the original notion of truth, even as the correctness of the subjective representation takes over. And he says the ambiguity is illustrated in the following sentence. Now, I just tapped out this translation a little while ago, and his translation is, of course, quite different because he's bringing out different aspects for his purposes. But I thought I'll read this translation, and then we can, just so that we have something to balance against the way he is interpreting it. So this is an expression of Socrates after he's discussed the comparison between the cave analogy and the idea of the good and the ideas outside. So he says, a God knows if it happens to be true, but this is how the appearances appear to me. That's an awkward thing to say in English, but it's what the Greek has. Ta phenomena moi, phainatai. The appearances, how they appear to me. So there's obviously a degree of diffidence about whether or not this is a concrete picture of reality. This is how the difference between reality and appearance appear to me. The idea of the good is the final idea, the last idea to be seen, and it's barely seen and with difficulty. But when it is seen, one might reasonably conclude that this is the cause for everyone of everything correct and beautiful, since in the visible it has given birth to its ruler, the light of the sun, and in the intelligible, it itself, or she herself, is the ruler who provides truth and intellect, and that it's necessary for anyone who wants to act intelligently, whether in private or in public, to see it. Yeah, the word act intelligently, yeah, it means, in control of oneself, but also using one's mind. Now, there's a figure of speech called chiasmos, because it comes from the letter chi, which is like an X in Greek. So if you see the two things that the idea of the good gives, in the third line, it gives to everyone everything correct and beautiful. And then in the intelligible, it gives truth and intellect. And this is extremely common in Greek literature. This is all over the Greek tragedians, that they have this figure of chiasmos, which means that you have the outer term and the inner term, and then you have another two terms. The inner term goes with the last of the first two terms, and then the outer term goes with the original outer term. And it's often called ring composition. So you have a list of 7 items. Around the middle item, there'll be 2 inner ones that go together, and then 2 more that go together, and then 2 more. And you have 7 items with 3 pairs, and it's called a ring composition, or chiasmos. And Heidegger correctly says this, that we want to read these across. So he says that, therefore, nous goes with orthos. Nous, mind, goes with correctness. And what is beautiful goes with the truth, because the truth is the beauty. And he's referring to a passage in the Phaedrus where Socrates says that beauty is the most manifest of the beings, of the ideas. And that it's the only one manifest in sensual experience. And he's quite right in that. That is a correct way of, when you read lists in a Greek text or a Greek tragedy, you'll often notice this pattern occurring, that the outer goes with the outer and so on. And then you get to the middle. And the middle is often the orientating word or term or verse for the rest. And it's also the place where the philosophers tend to hide things, but it's a different part of the same story. Okay, so Heidegger wants to correctly say that you can see in this sentence that we have these 2 aspects that reveal these two aspects, these two teachings about the truth at once. The correctness goes with the mind, but truth goes with beauty. That is, that the manifestation of beauty is part of the older version of truth. It's the unhidden.
Sorry, Martin, would you be able to share a diagram of the ring composition? I just had trouble kind of keeping up.
Let me, we should have a break, actually. I've gone over. Let me quickly scribble one and then I can put it on the screen.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
So if we stop there and come back at 7:20, 7:23, is that too precise?
That's good.
Okay, 7:23. Thank you. I'll speak to you then.
Thank you.
So in that sentence from page 4 of this second handout, where Socrates says, after seeing the idea of the good, one must reasonably conclude that this is the cause for everyone of everything correct? And beautiful. And this is the order in which he does it. I apologize for this handwriting. And then he says that it's reasonable to conclude that she herself is the ruler who provides truth. And intellect. Unhiddenness or mind. Now, if you just read the order of the sentence, there are these 4 terms, 1, 2, 3, 4. But that's not how they connect. And this is very frequent in Greek writing, is that the 2 inner ones go together and the 2 outer ones go together. And I've just made an X doing that, which is like the Greek key, letter key. So it's called a chiasmos, that the interpretation takes the things that are, takes the 2 outermost and connects them, and then the 2 innermost go together. Is that reasonably clear?
What's the reference to the sentence number in the text there, Martin, from the Republic?
517 B6 to C4. That's that whole paragraph.
Thank you.
And this is one example. And so you often get this in a sentence in a Greek author where they'll list 3 things and then they'll list another 3 things, and you have one. Oh, it's not working. Yeah, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but 3 and 4 go together, 2 and 5 go together, and 1 and 6 go together. And yeah, it occurs in much more extensive. If you read Sophocles or Aeschylus, sometimes a whole choral verse will be, say, 150 lines. And in the first line, the chorus will announce their respect for the goddess Athena. And then they'll move into a crime that a family committed, and so on and so forth. And then the last 10 lines will be about the current crime, not the ancient crime. And the last line will be about goddess Athena. So that's why it's called a ring pattern, because you come into the core and then you go back out through the rings. It's very common and very intricate sometimes. And it's part of the beauty of Greek poetry. Okay.
So Martin, they didn't know the construction, comma, respectively, where it's linear.
Yeah. No, there's no respectively. That's right. Or if someone uses a similar word, it has a completely different meaning.
Yeah. So just to comment on this 5. So these days we often talk about sort of in modern thinking, three realms: the good, the true, and the beautiful. Well, in this depiction, the good is the superior in the sense that it's the source of both the beautiful and the true.
Yes, and the just.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is what's actually astonishing for the interlocutors of Socrates a few pages before the cave analogy, because he's been saying, well, we'll make our philosophical rulers, virtuous and so on. And then he says, but of course there remains the greatest thing, and they're nonplussed because they thought they'd been through the greatest things, the human excellences, the virtues and justice. And he says, no, it's that light of intelligibility within which justice is even knowable. That's the higher thing. Okay. So that's today's philological lesson. I think I've stopped that many too.
Did you want to keep going?
Okay, so what Plato teaches about the idea of the good expresses this ambiguity in his teaching, that he's introduced a new notion of the truth as well as having some aspects of the old notion in it. So the idea of the good is the original source, the enabling of the essence of everything correct as well as everything beautiful, but also the mistress who bestows unhiddenness as well as apprehension. And as we just saw with that figure, the mind corresponds to correctness and beauty with the truth. And those one beauty is something that's manifest, and therefore it relates to what is immanifest, but the immanifest essence of what's manifest. And that's the older idea of truth that Heidegger suggests that Plato is replacing with the mind corresponding correctly with what is. Okay, so then he gives a brief history of metaphysics. We have the same ambiguity in Aristotle, and he just gives a reference to this first quote, but I put the first quote in there, and he quotes the second quote. So the first quote is the older idea of truth, that truth is that which belongs to being. And then the second is the notion that truth belongs to how we think about things. So I'll read the first quote, and this is from the beginning of Book Theatre of the Metaphysics. Being and non-being is spoken of in respect to the figures of the categories, substance, place, quality, and so on, in respect of potentiality and actuality, but most authoritatively in respect of true and false. So to be true is the most, that is to be manifest, is the most authoritative way of speaking about being. And that's like the older, like what Plato is now saying is the older view. But then in another place, Aristotle says that the true and the false are not in things, but in discursive thought, because you've either said something that matches what is the thing is, or you haven't. Okay, and then that is so. Therefore, Aristotle is locating truth in the things and in the mind. And in Aquinas, he doesn't have that first sense, according to me, just in this brief example. But he says truth is properly found in the human intellect or the divine intellect. But that means it's found in the intellect. It's not the process of the emergence process of being and in the beings. It's in the intellect, human or divine. Now we've firmly located truth in the intellect, and then with modernity we avoid or dispose of the divine intellect and refer only to the human intellect, and that's Descartes saying it is possible for the truth or falsity it is possible for the truth or falsity to be nowhere else but in the intellect. And that's, Descartes can say that because if you read the Fifth Discourse on Method, he's made God into as sort of an original arrangement of a chaos of atoms that it gradually evolves by what we now call natural laws into the cosmos we have now. But God doesn't have an intellect in Descartes' view. But that view, that the truth or falsity is in the intellect, leads to this view that was alluded to by Heidegger, that to be is to be perceived, that the world is the world of ideas that is that projected from the mind, and therefore we have no idea of what the world is, or that there is no world, and so on. Leads to these questions that people since this period have been trying to answer, Kant, and so on. Okay, so that notion that the truth is that which is knowable by the mind then reaches a kind of fulfillment with Nietzsche. And this is a quote from Nietzsche's Will to Power. Yeah, not actually a book of Nietzsche, in many cases, illuminating on what he did write in his books, because most of it is drafts for the book. And therefore, some people would say that the Will to Power is a collection of discarded drafts, and we're better off with the published works. And I'm partly sympathetic to that, but sometimes he writes things that are extremely helpful to understanding what is published. So anyway, truth is the kind of error without which a certain kind of living being could not live. So Nietzsche doesn't get rid of kinds of things. He just says that's derivative, right? In the final analysis, the value for life is what is decisive. Okay, so truth is an error. That is to say, everything we take to be true, everything we affirm is always a fabrication, but it's a fabrication that we require, that a species or a kind of life requires to go on existing and to express its power. Now, so consequence for Western thinking. Being present is no longer what it was in the beginning of Western thinking. That is, the emergence of the hidden into unhiddenness. So being present and visible to the mind is no longer what it was, which is a temporary occurrence, where the unhiddenness itself, as revealing, constitutes the fundamental trait of being present. He returns now to Plato's description, and Plato at one point says to Glaucon, wouldn't someone who's been outside the cave and seen the truth, wouldn't they think little of the kind of Sophia, which is a Greek word for wisdom, Sophia, wouldn't they think little of the kind of wisdom present in the cave? And Heidegger makes of that remark a notion that there's two kinds of wisdom presented in the cave analogy. First of all, the wisdom in the cave, which is, okay, so wisdom itself is being astute about that which is present as the unhidden and which as present perdures. So there's the wisdom in the cave and the wisdom outside the cave. And the wisdom in the cave is to know which of the shadows are passing next. The wisdom outside the cave is to have your gaze fixed upon the unchanging forms. And his argument is that Plato has constructed this image to make persuasive the notion that the wisdom outside the cave surpasses that inside the cave. And that therefore, the best life is that which is inclined towards that wisdom. And one of the words for to have affection is philos. It usually means friendship, but it can mean to any kind of affection. So the affection for wisdom, understood as the affection for the ideas, is philosophia. And so this is the beginning of the tradition of philosophy, understood in this way, theoretical philosophy, I would say. So since Plato, philosophy, I've used the word theoretical because I think that's what's behind his references to gazing straight up and so forth, that looking upon the ideas is highest. Since Plato, philosophy has become theoretical, or thinking about the being of beings has become, in quotes, philosophy, because it is a matter of gazing up at the ideas. And philosophy has become metaphysics because it goes beyond the things we experience to the supra-sensuous ideas and beyond them to their cause, the idea of the God. for Aristotle's divinity. He quotes Aristotle, and he quotes a Greek phrase, to theon. And Aristotle in book Lambda has this argument from the actuality of the things we experience to actuality in itself as the divine. So since Plato, philosophy has become metaphysics. It passes beyond the things of our experience to their supra-sensuous cause, and metaphysics has become theology because we now nominate that supra-sensuous cause as the highest being. So it's not just the being of things, it's a being itself that is the cause of all the other beings we experience. Now, at the same time, philosophy has become humanism. Human beings move into a central place among beings and become the objects of a metaphysical system for their improvement. And that's summarizing a paragraph, by which I think he means, I'll just put very simply what I think he means, which is that if the intellect is able to comprehend the atemporal principles of human life, it will then, of course, set about trying to improve human life in the light of those standards. And according to Heidegger, that's our problem, is that we're not orientated by a more organic, spontaneous, wholehearted comportment towards our essence. We're using human beings as objects of a narrower technological understanding of things. Okay, so you know how in many courses, people will say something about why the course is relevant, which is I always find obnoxious, because the point is to make yourself relevant. Well, if you have the ability to make someone like a Heidegger or a Plato relevant to you, then that's the achievement. It's not finding some way in which something we say nowadays is related to something said at another time or place. But Heidegger has a nice sentence on the relevance to us of his understanding of the cave analogy. Rather than a merely influential historical event, quote, this change in the essence of truth is present as the all-dominating fundamental reality, long established and thus still in place, of the ever-advancing world history of the planet in this most modern of times. Now, that's the end of that summary, and that leaves a couple of paragraphs at the end of the essay that I thought it might be helpful to look at as well. But that's good. We've gotten through that. So if there are other passages and if there are questions about anything that we've just rapidly skimmed through that we can discuss, then that would be good. Let's discuss them.
So yeah, Martin, I have a question. So assuming that, so today you're basically, as you said, you're trying to put Heidegger's position at its strongest, and assuming that you're sort of adopting his criticism of the allegory of the cave, and you describe it as a theoretical philosophy with a kind of, in a way, a negative sense of theoretical there. So what did he provide a term for his own kind of thinking? You said, he regarded himself as a thinker, not a philosopher. So would he just say, look, I'm not a theoretical philosopher, I'm a thinker, and my thinking is something that goes back to the pre-Socratics and regards them as more fundamental than what's happened with and since Plato?
Yes, that is what he says. So you hear, one of the collections in English of his works is Early Greek Thinkers, because Parmenides and Heraclitus are thinkers who are, in his view, open to this fundamental reality of truth, and not like Plato, theoretical.
And I'll just ask my last question, because I don't want to be too greedy. I'm very greedy. I don't want to be too greedy. So if this is based upon if his criticism and so much of his thought is based upon the pre-Socratics, doesn't, for him to advocate something radically different from the Platonic approach and its and what's come from it, how can he do that on the basis of the pre-Socratics who are so obscure to us? You know, they are so utterly obscure to us, and you know, there's, you know, how can I put this? You know, everyone accepts that modernity has got all the problems that we talk about every day. You know, but I'd have thought that to respond to that constructively, is it really plausible to think of doing it on the basis of a kind of poetic response, if that's what he's advocating for?
Well, it is definitely a poetic understanding of the truth. And what makes that plausible to me is that if I gave you a scientific understanding of a human being, you know, listed the various chemical elements and their weights and proportions in the human body and so on, and how they've evolved to this point because, like other animals, we don't want to die. And so we've evolved certain behaviors and so on. And then read you the chorus from Sophocles' Antigone on the human being. You know, there are many Dana things, many uncanny beings, but man is the uncanniest. And then follows this description of the eruption of human thinking and acting in the world. Which one has more truth? So what I'll do next week is I'll do that. I'll find what I take to be a reductive technological understanding of the human being, and I'll write up a brief translation of the third chorus of Antigone.
Yeah.
And so what's more true? Isn't it the chorus?
Yeah, of course it is. And everyone in a Western country has got access to the great tradition of poetry and art, just as we've got access to all of the scientific papers. And as laymen, we don't read scientific papers in whatever, unless we're...
I've actually been reading quite a bit of immunology and epidemiology recently, previously having had no interest in the topics, but carry on.
Yeah. So that's for a particular practical reason.
Yes.
It's not because you want to become an immunologist.
But I'm meeting HR tomorrow.
For whatever. Yeah. Okay. Well, good luck with that.
Yeah.
But
I'll bring the pom-poms.
Yeah. Thanks.
but you know, we've all got access to the great traditions of art. It's just that not many human beings these days seem to spend their free time in that world.
Yes. Now, isn't that where Heidegger has a very powerful point? That it's not technological access. I mean, right now you can go to the folio edition of Shakespeare as held in the British Library. You can go to the Museum of the Parthenon in Greece and see all of the marbles up close from 57 different angles. Like, it's amazing what's available. When I was trying to teach some Greek online last year, I'd found some manuscripts that I've never been able to see before. They've just been put online the last few years. And the oldest possible papyrus, which was written in 360. So Plato was only dead for 15 years, and we actually have fragments of writing, and it's amazing what you can find. But I don't think that's what all of internet traffic is devoted to, from what I read in the papers. So yes, but doesn't that give power to Heidegger's point that our fundamental, we are caught somehow in a frame of understanding things such that all of that is just, shall we say, data, and that we are not illumined and enlivened by the highest at all.
Yeah, I think that's right. But
okay, well that would lend power to his saying, we are somehow caught in an understanding of things that that means that it doesn't matter what's available to us. Sorry, I interrupted someone else speaking.
Well, just against that, taste and discernment in the arts and beauty surely depend on these very things that Plato is asserting.
If he's right,
about what is good art, good literature, good music, etc., ultimately takes you back to what Plato's talking about, I'd say.
well, one or the other is right. So I mean, I'm much more inclined to Plato's view, which is that there are these, principles of beauty, justice, and different civilizations. And I'm now going to make a criticism. I hope this is not too distasteful, but different civilizations in this view are more or less civilized. Greek civilization, the Renaissance civilization, Chinese civilization. These are genuine civilizations, but they are more or less civilized. That's why you say that's an uncivilized act. Now, the historical point of view, which is Nietzsche's and Heidegger's, is that the fundamental unit, is culture, not civilization. And there's no standard outside the culture. It's an historical given thing. And precisely in this book, the Introduction to Metaphysics, where Heidegger discusses the third chorus in Antigone, the reason why he finds that so illuminating is because it talks violently about the eruption of human beings into nature. And his point is that it's not just violence in the physical sense, but it's necessarily violence in the physical sense, that any human understanding and authenticity as a people requires violence, because there are no outside standards, and you must make and create these standards to be a people by acting violently. So, I mean, that's a very, I am crudely contrasting these things. I just happen to have a book by Burnett, who is the editor of the standard edition of Plato, the 5-volume Oxford set. That's standard in France and Germany as well. It has been it has been since about 1900. And he wrote a book dedicated to a number of dead students in 1919 on culture and civilization. And he's trying to explicate this difference. And I'm very sympathetic to his argument. Maybe I'll copy some of it out next week. Because that to me is the danger of the historicist point of view, is that there aren't human standards qua human. There's only the historical given.
So that's interesting, Martin. So was this a kind of a tribute to students who had died in the war?
Well, it was actually a book on what we do now about education. And he was comparing and contrasting British education, which he was saying needed change. And he was saying we can learn this from the Germans, who had this most comprehensive education. But he had this warning that this understanding of culture, not civilization, he regarded as dangerous for the reasons I mentioned.
Can you send us a reference to the book later, please, Martin?
I'll copy out a quote and put the full reference in the handout for next week.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Martin, I just had a question in relation to what was set out at 6A in your handout, and it's at the top of page 175, and just the notion of what an idea is or ideas are. And I think it's related to form, and I'm just wondering if that suggests what's set out there in terms of an idea suggests a relationship with function. So I'm at the top of page 175, and so the ideas are what is in everything that is, therefore what makes every idea be capable as an idea in Plato's expression. And I'm interested in Plato's expression. The idea of all ideas consists in making possible the appearing in all its visibility of everything present. That, I mean, as I grapple with the concept of form, that suggests to me the idea of form. There you go. And then to sort of resolve that in my head, I'm thinking, can that be thought of by thinking of the function of a thing, or, if I want to be controversial, the purpose of a thing, in that a form can derive from the purpose of a chair, and that once you have the purpose of a chair, the form then appears from that, and then from that, the chair, the actual shape the chair takes can be manifold. And so we've got that for inanimate objects, and thinking then about natural objects, and it sounds circular, but then like the function or the purpose of a sheep is to make other sheep, and I'm sure the ram would agree with that. But even from just a natural world physical point of view, that even though that's sort of the purpose of natural things is to make other natural things of the same species, of the same type, you do see that in nature. They're all geared towards making babies, and trees making other trees. So I'm just wondering, and it is a question, whether or not thinking about function or purpose informs this notion of what the idea is, and whether that's a helpful way to think about things, or whether I'm just off on a frolic.
Well, the idea encompasses the end. What becomes divided in Aristotle as the formal and final cause of it. The end, not the purpose, but the end, which is the fulfillment of a thing, and the form, that is the look of the thing. Now, Plato doesn't make this division. He's saying that the form encompasses the look, because what a thing is its characteristic activity at its best. Right? And so
Where I was, sorry. No, because where I was going, because it was sort of, well, how do I think about this? What is it that makes everything capable of being? So in Plato's expression, the idea of all ideas consists in making possible the appearing in all its visibility of everything present. That to me said, well, what is that? And I just thought, well, that's its function. If you resolve thinking around what a thing's function is, then that helps understand this idea of all ideas. That's what makes that's what then allows the chair to appear in whatever way, in the millions of ways you can make a chair. And a chair can be anything, and you can say a chair can have 4 legs, and then you have a chair with 3 legs, and you'll say, well, it's still a chair. And it all seems to shoot back to you. What allows you to do that is because you've distilled the function or the purpose of the thing.
That makes good sense. Yes. Yeah, because the idea refers to fundamentally to what it is, but what something is not the number of legs it has, or how far it goes, or if it's for an instrument, for an artifact, it's its use, and for a living being, it's its characteristic activity.
Which I would say is to reproduce, and that sounds very circular, but then it's also how you would distinguish.
Yeah, well,
only tigers can make other tigers, you know what I mean?
Yeah, in the symposium, there are 3 levels of eros. And the first level is everything living wants to live on, not through itself. Well, it would like to, but doesn't. It leaves something that's same in kind, but not same in number. That's an Aristotelian phrase, which has
yeah. Thank you.
No, thanks for that. And
but also,
I thought I might just, I'll stop the recording. We've actually accomplished a fair bit of, we've accomplished what we needed to do to hopefully give some due to Heidegger. Next week, I'll try and make things more possible for a comparison. And also I'll stop recording now. I just have to stop sharing.